Chapter 1. The Mountain That Breathes Fire. The pressure of the absolute Sinai stood in silence, but its silence was not peace. It was a lurking, formidable majesty, the very breath of God burning in the fire. Every stone of the mountain, it seemed, gained consciousness and trembled in anticipation. The entire atmosphere around the camp was tense, thick, like the air before the fiercest storm. But this storm had been here for days. Above the heads of the Israelites, who remained at a distance from the holy boundary, hung the constant pressure of an invisible presence. Moses, the only mortal allowed into the kingdom of fire, ascended the mountain, leaving behind the noisy, impatient world. Clouds, like heavy curtains of black velvet, shrouded the summit, concealing it from view but not from hearing. There, within that veil, where thunder became the word and lightning the eternal seal, God spoke. It was a dialogue of eternity with time, where Moses, a man of clay, stood as the witness and scribe of the Creator. He fasted, needing neither water nor bread, for his soul was saturated by a presence that surpassed any earthly necessity. But for the people below, time moved differently. Initially, they waited with fear and awe, clinging to their tents, listening to the rumbling from the peak. This was a healthy fear that kept them from sin. Then, that fear gave way to impatience, as the days stretched out like endless nights, filled only with sand and the monotonous sound of the wind. Their short memories, freshly cleansed from Egyptian slavery, began to fill again with the phantoms of doubt. They saw Moses only as a man, but failed to see the God who upheld him. The hearts that had recently trembled before the Almighty's power began to cool, like ashes of a bonfire abandoned at dawn. Every sunrise that did not bring Moses back was to them proof of his disappearance. They interpreted the silence as emptiness, and the mountain's mystery as absence. The desert cruelly demanded visible, tangible evidence of their liberation. It pressed upon them with its infinite expanse, whispering, "You have been deceived. Your God has turned away. You are alone." This realization of solitude was the most terrible ordeal, pushing them to seek a swift, visual replacement for the invisible protector. They needed an idol that could be seen, touched, and commanded. Chapter 2. The Silence That Became Temptation. The fall of Aaron Moses' prolonged absence became not merely a physical vacuum, but a fissure in the very foundation of their faith. It was a vacuum of leadership, which immediately began to fill with panic and old, slavish habits. Each day, as his familiar, resolute figure failed to appear from behind the heavy clouds over Sinai, the Israelites looked up at the mountain, where the Lord's glory still flashed with lightning, and failed to grasp. Is Moses still alive? Was he deceived or consumed by that wrath? Will he return? And if not, what will become of us, left without a mediator, alone with this formidable, incomprehensible God? Fear, mingled with doubt, began to grow in their souls, like a poisonous weed in soil fertilized by slave memories. Uncertainty became the most terrifying enemy. They could no longer live in the ambiguity of the covenant. They needed a controllable God who spoke the familiar language of Egypt, one to whom they could immediately offer sacrifice and receive a sense of certainty. And so they came to Aaron. Aaron, Moses' brother, now stood as the only visible authority before the wave of collective hysteria. His face was pale, his eyes darting between the formidable peak of Sinai and the inflamed crowd. Make us a God who will go before us?" they demanded, their voices sharp and uncompromising. "For we do not know what has become of this Moses. He led us out of Egypt, and now he has abandoned us." Aaron was silent. Two forces wrestled in his heart: obedience to God, the one who had just revealed himself in thunder and fire, and fear of the crowd, which could instantly turn him into a victim. He was a prophet, but not a warrior. He was a mediator, but not a rock-like leader. Fear pierced him like a sharp blade, paralyzing his will. He chose the physical survival here and now over fidelity to the invisible covenant. This was the tragedy of compromise. He attempted a subtle maneuver, hoping to buy time. "Take off the gold earrings that are on the ears of your wives, your sons, and your daughters, and bring them to me." He expected this demand for sacrifice to cool their fervor, but he underestimated the power of the slave mentality. The people rushed to their tents and, without hesitation, surrendered their golden ornaments, the last souvenirs of Egypt. When Aaron collected this gold, this glittering, heavy proof of betrayal, he melted it in the fire and fashioned an idol. He did not sculpt it carefully. He simply poured the metal into a mold, creating a calf, glistening like the sun over the desert itself, which became the symbol of their greed and earthly power. When the people saw this shining deity, shouts of joy erupted like thunder breaking from the cliffs. It was a liberation from spiritual tension, from the incomprehensible majesty of Sinai. "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt," the crowd roared. They had reassigned their liberator, replacing God with a piece of metal. They wanted their God to be of gold, to be wealth, not truth. Chapter 3. A festival without God. Regression to chaos. The next morning, the camp awoke not for prayer, but for an orgy of forgetfulness. Aaron, realizing his compromise had become a catastrophe, was now further entrenched. He built an altar before the calf, trying to legitimize, to civilize this sin, perhaps subconsciously believing he could infuse the pagan form with some Israelite content. But sin cannot be civilized. They offered sacrifices, and the smell of burnt fat and meat rose, not as a sacred prayer, but as smoke filled with pride and treachery. It was the scent of apostasy mingling with the hot desert air. The people, released for the yoke of spiritual discipline, plunged into a frenzy of pleasure. They ate, drank, and danced, and their joy quickly turned into savagery. This was not merely a religious festival, it was an act of regression, a return to the debauchery they had witnessed in Egypt. Timbrels thundered, a heavy, monotonous, hypnotic rhythm that drowned out any voice of reason or conscience. Laughter rang out, too loud, too empty, and the camp's clamor turned into a frantic, chaotic roar that ascended to heaven as a challenge to an angry Sinai. Men and women mingled in a dance that grew increasingly indecent. Their liberation from slavery was meant to lead to holiness, but instead, it led them to licentiousness. The desert, which yesterday was a house of testing, a school of faith and honor, became an arena of madness. Aaron looked at the crowd, and his eyes reflected powerlessness and horror. He was no longer a leader, but a hostage to his own compromise. He knew he had lost control not only over the people, but also over himself. He stood on the edge of an abyss built by his own hands, and the sin was so sweet and contagious that it threatened to consume the chosen nation entirely. His only wish was for Moses to return and bear the burden of this unspeakable, mortal sin. Chapter 4. On the mountain, fire below. Ashes. The shattered tablets. On the summit of Sinai, Moses was in a state of highest bliss and concentration. In his hands lay tablets, stone into which the Lord himself had inscribed his words. These were not just laws. They were the concentrate of divine will, proof of the covenant's eternity. Moses had no doubts, only ecstatic certainty. But then the Lord's glory, which had just shone with mercy, began to tremble with wrath. The sky above the summit seemed to turn red, and the thunder's rumble sounded like the roar of a wounded beast. God spoke, "Go down, for your people, whom you brought up out of the land of Egypt, have corrupted themselves. They have quickly turned aside from the way that I commanded them." Moses saw not only the sin, but the depth of God's indignation. He saw Mount Sinai tremble under the wrath of heaven, which was already poised to incinerate the camp. In the moment Moses held the covenant in his hands, he realized that the covenant itself had already been broken, and he descended. With every step, he fell from the peak of spiritual exaltation into the abyss of human disappointment. As he neared the camp, increasingly loud sounds reached his ears. At first, he thought it was the cry of war, but then he recognized it was not the wail of the beaten, nor the prayer of salvation, but shouts of pleasure, wild, senseless music, and uninhibited laughter. And then he saw it, the golden calf shining in the sun as if alive, illuminated by the very desert majesty that the people should have rendered to God. It was selfishness materialized in gold. Moses saw Aaron helpless as a child, and the crowd dancing in shameless frenzy. His face became stone, harder than the tablets in his hands. The symbol was unbearable. The commandments he carried were pure and unbreakable, but the people's hearts were stained and shattered. There was no point in giving whole commandments to a people who had already trampled them. Moses raised the tablets high above his head and hurled them down with furious determination. Thunder sounded among the stones as the covenants broke into pieces, just like the hearts of those who had forgotten God. It was an act of anger, but also an act of deep prophetic grief, a symbol of what had happened in the soul of Israel. The fire of rage flared in his eyes. He seized the calf, burned it in the fire, ground it into black ash, and scattered the powder upon the water. This was an act of defilement and humiliation of the false god. "Drink," he cried, his voice tearing through the wild music. "Drink your sin. Drink the ashes of your treachery. Let them become bitterness in your stomachs." Chapter 5. The Day of Cleansing. The Sword of Division. A silence fell over the camp, but it was not a restful silence, but a dead, suffocating silence of terror. Moses stood amidst the ashes, his figure, just moments ago, filled with rage, now cold and dangerous as steel. Around him, thousands of eyes, full of fear, confusion, and sobering reality. They had seen the consequences of their night of madness. They feared no longer Moses, but the wrath that stood behind him. Moses, knowing that the sin could not simply be washed away by water, that blood was required for purification and restoration of the covenant, resorted to a terrible but necessary act of justice. His next action was the cruelest lesson. Faith requires choice. He stood at the gate of the camp and cried out, his voice sounding like a trumpet in the void. "Who is on the Lord's side? Come to me." This was the sword of division, a demand for immediate, unconditional allegiance. And only the tribe of Levi, who had apparently not participated in the deepest orgy, gathered around him. They were ready. Moses, with a heavy heart but an unwavering will, gave the command, "Thus says the Lord, let every man gird on his sword on his thigh, and go from gate to gate throughout the camp, and let every man kill his brother, and every man his friend, and every man his neighbor." The Levites drew their swords. This was not a joyful, vengeful hunt. It was a terrible, sacred duty. They walked through this camp, executing the will of the Lord, cleansing it with blood, cutting off the rotten organ from the body. It was a mortal test of loyalty. On that day, 3,000 people perished. It was a fearful price for a night of moral freedom, but it was necessary so that the rest of the people understood that the God who liberates is also the God of holiness and justice. The sin was deeper than a wound. It was the poisoned breath of the nation, and it had to be expelled. Every survivor saw with their own eyes. Compromise with paganism leads to death, and fidelity cost the highest price. The Levites, who performed this harsh duty, were consecrated to the Lord through the bloodshed for the sake of truth. Chapter 6. Supplication and Glory. The new light of the covenant, Moses, ascended the mountain again. This time, he went not as a triumphant leader, but as an intercessor, bearing the sin of an entire nation on his shoulders. In his heart, there was no anger or condemnation, only unbearable pain and a deep, all-encompassing love for these stubborn, treacherous people. He left the camp, leaving behind ashes and blood, and went straight to the source of wrath to stand between him and his people. He fell before God, and his plea was the deepest sacrifice a man can offer. Please forgive their sin, but if not, blot me out of your book that you have written. He asked for either complete forgiveness or offered to exchange his own life for the life of his people. This was an act of the highest solidarity, the apotheosis of leadership. And the Lord had mercy. He could not accept Moses' sacrifice, for the true sacrifice had to be spotless, but he accepted his intercession. God promised to walk with the people again. But the commandments had to be restored. Moses, taking 2 new blocks of stone, prepared them and once again ascended the mountain, where he remained for 40 days and 40 nights, again without bread or water. This was the renewal of the shattered covenant, the work of purification and reconciliation. At the end of this time, Moses was rewarded with the highest gift. He did not see the face of God, but he was allowed to see his glory passing by him, hiding him in the cleft of the rock. This was such an unearthly, all-consuming revelation that it changed his very nature. When Moses descended a second time, carrying the new tablets in his hands, his face shone with a light that frightened the people. It was not a man-made light. It was a reflection of the presence of God, a light that reminded them, His glory does not abandon those who repent and sincerely serve Him. They could not look at Him, and Moses had to cover his face with a veil, a curtain between divine holiness and human weakness. Thus, the people of Israel understood the deepest truth. God is not an idol, not gold, not an image created by human hands. He is spirit, fire, and truth. And only faith, which endured the test of wrath and humiliation, cleanses the heart from the shadow of betrayal. The veil on Moses' face became a permanent, physical reminder of how close they had come to destruction and how dearly their salvation cost.